You're at live.
So just go ahead and start here. All right. Hello, folks. I guess we're live on the air now. I will get started. Thank you to the Antique Boat Museum for inviting me, first of all. Appreciate that greatly. This is a talk I've kind of given this same sort of talk a few times in the last year or so. A lot of it comes down because people, they ask you to tell me about the native occupations up here, and it's like, where do you begin and where do you end? Because it's a big story. It's 13,000 years long. So tonight I'm going to try to give it to you in about a 60-minute nutshell, so it's a lot to take in, but I think if you really want to know about the native population and what they went through in the last 13,000 years, you have to really understand about the rest of what happened up here, which is the geological history and the ecological environment. I mean, things were crazy for a long time. So we're going to go through a little of that right now. And so I say up here that it's 12,500 years ago, which is basically when the earliest that we can safely say that there was dry land where I'm standing, maybe, or maybe at 300 feet sea level. Right now we're at maybe 260. 250. So another 50 feet higher would have been dry land about this stage. So that's kind of why I use that, because let's see, I didn't even do that. I made this nice little thing. Okay, so this view I got doesn't give me my notes, so I'm just gonna wing it. So yeah, to understand the people of the past is to understand how the landscape changed, right? Which has really changed a lot. I mean, people have seen a lot of change in their own lifetimes and things like that, but you have no idea what's gone down out here in the last 13,000 years. So they basically, people that are native persuasion have been here for the last 13,000 years, even as a glacial lake, because we all know the glaciers shaped our region, right? Well, the glaciers retreated, the end of the ice age, and it left a giant lake, basically right where we are. So picture this chunk of ice leveling our landscape pretty much. It melts down and leaves us underneath a giant puddle that makes Lake Ontario look like a puddle. So if you were to go back 13,000 years ago, this is what you would see in terms of a map, right? Now this is kind of rough because in science things change all the time. Next week, somebody will tell me I'm wrong by 3 miles or 4 years or something, whatever. It doesn't really matter. That we're talking in generality, folks. So what you're looking at here is what's Glacial Lake, Iroquois. All right, and you'll see up in the north there, you'll see the ice sheet that's actually retreating at this point, and you'll see that Tug Hill down here, right? That's kind of the shoreline in our neck of the woods. So the only Jefferson County landscapes taking out of the water was Tug Hill. All right, which is pretty interesting. And then actually at the time, you can see where this yellow arrow shows you how that lake was being drained. Not through the St. Lawrence River Valley, but actually through the Mohawk River Valley into another glacial lake called Lake Albany, which drained through New York City into the ocean. Now, this is kind of the way it went for an unknown period of time. I'm not going back that far, but X amount of time, we'll say, and then something kind of changes around a little bit. And so at that time, 13,000 years ago, we know there was people living here. Why? Because up on Fort Drum, right, on what's called the Pine Plains now, are actually sand dunes, beach, and there's a glacial lake shoreline there that's exposed. And at that point, the archaeologist there, Dr. Rush, Lori Rush, dear friend of mine and her colleagues, located and identified a paleo marine culture that was actually, when I say marine, folks, in this case, because I know my good friend Dr. Bruce Ripperto is watching it, I mean fresh water marine, not salt. I'm just using it as a term. So the paleo marine culture is the first identified culture in our area. These people are on the shoreline of this icy looking lake making boats. They're sitting there making boats out of skin. Now, they were able to identify this by recreating the tools, mimicking how they were used, etc., matching up the wear patterns. And yes, that's exactly what they found. And on top of that, they said, hey, this site's at this elevation, that hill over there, that should have a shoreline, that should have been an island at the time. And they said, okay, there should be sites over there. They went over and checked, and sure enough. So this is the first identified culture. So picture 13,000 years ago, before there was land where we are, boat people were here, right? That's why this is a good subject for this boat museum, because these would have been the actual first people utilizing boats in our region a long time ago, all right? And this is the time of the fluted point. Now, you've all heard of the fluted points. These are paleo points, mammoth hunting, right? So when I talk about paleo, that's the paleo period. It's the earliest humans up here. And you got to think of those big game hunters generally, hunting down mammoths, things like this, sort of stuff like that. But in reality, there was also a whole other component, which is these paleo marine people, which are people just like people all across the world lived on the coasts. They were focusing on these marine resources, right? I mean, it's great to go out and almost get yourself half killed by a mammoth to hunt it down. But on the other hand, wouldn't it be easier just to make some nets and catch some fish? Maybe take your boat out a little ways from shore in that ice back there and you know, hunt for whatever. Seems to me it's a little safer, a little more cost effective than hunting a mammoth. But it was a combination in our area, because we found these fluted points in our area. Not very many of them, but there have been some of these fluted points found at the elevation we're at now. So even today's elevation, some of our islands and the shoreline basically we've got now in this setting now, we've found points of this persuasion. There was some found by down by Henderson. There was broken points found on Rowland Island. There was a point found in Spicer Bay, excuse me, and one found in Cedar Point, all identified as fluted points, besides one found in Fort Drum near this location. So all kind of fits together. These people were doing multiple things, but they stayed at the shoreline. They don't find camps or anyplace else. Shoreline, where they was at. Okay, so something happens though on this glacial lake. Somebody pulled the plug. Poof. Okay, that big chunk of ice you saw sitting up there in the lower St. Lawrence Valley, all of a sudden it's gone. We don't know if it got to a melt point and suddenly just let go, or you know, I don't know. That's out of my world. But anyway, all of a sudden things change big time. No longer is this glacial lake rolling down the Mohawk River Valley, but the gates of heck unleashed and it went up our river. Suddenly we have the very first version of the St. Lawrence River was born. All right, now this occurs in this tight 13,000 year time period. So picture that you are on the shoreline back there watching, you know, the lake, and you're maybe making dinner or just working on your boat, and all of a sudden the lake starts dropping. And you're like, wow, what's going on here? And in the course of just 200 years, which is, you know, only a few generations, right? In the course of a couple hundred years, best estimates are 200, 225 years, it goes from this elevation of 600 feet sea level down to about 300 feet sea level. So that, I mean, that's like, you're on the shore going, wow, where's the lake going? So there was a big change, big change. But at the same time, that change went from the shoreline of a glacial lake and transitioned into another water coastal environment. So the marine resources did not necessarily just go poof with the lake, right? Because what happens is you end up with the first river with a lake and a river nobody would know if you were there today. It would look very similar to this, okay? Kind of just a track of flat, wow, very similar to Alaska, that kind of thing, and just totally unrecognizable, okay? But this was the first version of our river, all right? And it may have actually, elevation-wise, it may have been, and this is kind of an unknown because it hasn't been closely studied in our segment starting from eastern on Lake Ontario to Ottawa. It's not been studied in depth that much. Guessing that around 300 feet civil, it's about 50 feet higher than we are now. We would have had this kind of crazy looking river, but there's our first river. Can't knock that. 12,500 years ago. Okay, but this thing is dumping into the Champlain Valley, down through to the Hudson and to the sea that way. It doesn't go all the way to the ocean yet. Takes a side detour because there's still a big chunk of ice sitting up there farther on the lower St. Lawrence Valley. Okay, and it was just a different landscape. There wasn't any consistent shorelines because, again, think about having this drastic change go down. So everything's kind of changing and drying out, maybe getting a little wetter, little channels are opening up here and there. This whole thing's got partial tundra this whole time. It's sort of changing out of tundra, but not really. Who knows how fast? It's just a crazy scene, right? And so this is basically kind of the beginning of what you call the coastal or littoral, is the proper term, Bruce, of our landscape, right? Coastal landscape, that's really what we are. And when I say coastal landscape, I consider that basically most of this lowland from the Tug Hill to the river and to the lake, right? It's the eastern Lake Ontario, upper St. Lawrence Valley lowlands. It's the geologic term for it. But it's all a coastal area. Especially early on, there wasn't vast stretches of dry land on our area, right? There's a lot of tundra and marsh and things like this. Really a crazy landscape. And so just when these people are getting kind of used to that, kind of getting used to having, okay, here's the river, it's going down to Lake Champlain and taking a right-hand turn and kind of getting a grip on things, something crazy goes out again, right? This is all crazy. So suddenly, maybe 12,000 years ago or 11,500, we don't know yet because things change, dates change. You have some new event, okay, and it's called the Champlain Sea event. Oh, this block of ice is gone, blocking the end of the St. Lawrence now, but that land was so low that now the sea comes rolling in, all right? And so now, weirdly enough, the ocean is down somewhere by Ogdensburg. And we have the second version of our river, which is very short. It's from Cape Vincent to Ogdensburg, or thereabouts. However long, not really quite sure. But I can tell you that all the entire Ottawa Valley and towards us for quite a ways, they found actual saltwater marine sediments. So that we know that that's where the ocean was. And in fact, in mid-1990s, I located a shell midden of clamshells down 6 feet under the ground in the middle of the street in Ogdensburg. It was in situ, it was intact in the side of an excavation. And of course, as soon as it's exposed to air, it just started disintegrating. But I do have some samples left from that to manage to salvage. But yeah, so, if we were living here, I might say, hey guys, let's get together, let's go down, let's go hunt some walrus and have some clams for dinner. And that would be the reality of our lifestyle. Yeah, let's do it, man. Let's go seal hunting. And believe it or not, seal, walrus bones have been found preserved in various places. Even beluga whales. Now, beluga whale bones have been found on the heights above Champlain. Because at that time, Lake Champlain was a fjord. Just like, Denmark, big, long, narrow fjord. And the marine peoples, right? Because if you'll notice the one common thing, it's always maintained this marine element, this coastal element that people could focus on those resources. So they never left. So these people are like adapting to a different resource. Now it's like, oh, not only can we just get all kinds of freshwater fish, but now we're going to go down, spend a couple of days downriver and get some beluga whale for, dinner. So pretty amazing. And of course, this is just, I mean, just to have you kind of picture in your head. Yeah, these guys were actually today, you go up to, I mean, this is early 20th century. This is Inuit skin boat in the Arctic Ocean. So to kind of, you sure those guys are really out there hunting whales out in that icy? Yeah. They're still kind of doing this same technique. So this is kind of what these people were doing. They were doing everything. Now they've got freshwater marine resources. And then a few miles down there, now they've got saltwater marine resources. So really, there it is again. The boat and the water are the common theme for the people that have been here. This has been the commonality. They never left the water. But something happened. The Champlain Sea event ends. And it ends hard. It ends really hard and dry. Something happens. And so at some point, and again, this becomes very unclear. 11,000 years ago, or a little less, or something of that nature, climate shifts, and what was feeding all this great water source we had here was Lake Ontario was this giant melting ice that was feeding down through the Niagara escarpment down through there and feeding this lake and just pouring all this water, and that's why we had all this water. Well, suddenly all that meltwater from those glaciers up there stops flowing in there. Just stops, okay? And Lake Ontario starts going like this, along with all the other Great Lakes. Now, they all have a little bit different timeline on this, but it was all basically called the Great Lakes Low Stand event. Every single lake in the Great Lakes was down hundreds and hundreds of feet lower than it is now today. In other words, I'm going to go visit Charity Shoals, where all Charity Shoals is out there in the lake. At that point in time, we would have just, gone by the waterfall at Tibbetts Point and walked out Charity Shoals. It was that far away. It's that crazy. So these poor people had to adapt again to a whole different scenario. But they still had marine resources. There's the shifting of the coastline. It's a shifting, right? It's not a going away, gone, let's run, go find some other place to live. They shifted with the coastline. And at this time, that newly exposed lake bed out there becomes a vast prairie. It's also part of something called the prairie expansion, Great Prairie Expansion, where the Great Lakes, where they drained down, all this prairie started expanding. Okay. Key to remember is during this point in time, also people that hunted and lived on the prairies expanded with it, started coming our way too. But at this time, there's also this landscape, this grassland starts being dominated by a single land animal. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, the weird thing is that here it says the river started flowing backwards. Well, it did. St. Lawrence River flowed backwards. So there's our third river. Okay. And yeah, it flowed backwards. If you think I'm crazy, I'm sure. So I'll try to make a short explanation of why you can tell that it flowed backwards. Okay. So we've all seen a map probably of Eastern Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence River. We kind of know the general landscape layout of that lake area. And we probably might know that the Trent River comes out near by Kingston, okay, right across the river. So bear that in mind. I'm going to show you a different map. That's a map of the bottom of Lake Ontario. It's called a bathymetry map, which has a lot of crazy colors, and it's going to be confusing, but I'll try to get through it to you. Okay, so the color means blue is deep, okay, and it graduates up to red being shallow. And we know what was going on by looking at this, okay? And you'll see right here something called the St. Lawrence Channel down at the bottom. That's formed by the St. Lawrence River running into Lake Ontario. And right, it doesn't show well, but right in here, there's something called the Thousand Island Sill. It's basically where the river ends and the lake starts, but it's a geologic formation, okay? So the lake drops, and on this sill, a waterfall starts forming. Right down there by Cape Vincent. Got a waterfall. All right. Same thing happens with the Black River. You see a Black River channel. All right. And during this period of time, when the water shuts off coming into the upper part of the Great Lakes, it starts pouring down the Trent River where this purple arrow is. All right. Now, all this can be traced back geologically. Okay. So I just didn't make it up. Okay. And so you can see how the St. Lawrence, our little chunk here, while the Great Lakes is suffering this lake low stand, we're not necessarily there. My personal estimation, just by observation alone, I guess, is that the St. Lawrence is liable to drop 20 to 50 feet below what we see now as a mean high average, but it might not drop that much at all. Don't know. There hasn't been a study done on the upper St. Lawrence Valley in this terms. But as soon as the Trent River Valley stops taking this meltwater, well, then Ottawa River starts taking it, and it all still keeps coming at us. Okay, so this whole thing, so yeah, the St. Lawrence River fed Lake Ontario. During this time, okay, this is when our original salmon species evolved in the Lake Ontario as a landlocked salmon species. Did not die. It's now extinct, thanks to us stupid white people. Pardon me. But my ancestors too. But this happened during some period. They couldn't swim back out to the ocean, the salmon. They got stuck in a lake that had no outlet. Evolution takes place, and in a few thousand years, they become landlocked. And that's what the Europeans first found when they came to the St. Lawrence, Upper St. Lawrence, and Lake Ontario. Wow, there's a salmon species, a landlocked salmon. That's how it formed. Also, if anybody's familiar with the Chenault Barrens, if you're not, look it up. There's particular species of plants there that are only found in the prairie west of the Mississippi. How'd they get there? During this Great Lake expansion period, when that grassland came sweeping up into where we are and gave us these guys. All right. And this is kind of the terminal, the ending of the Paleo period. And this animal dominated the landscape up here. He was the big boy. Because at this period of time, we had a lot of grasslands. And so we've all seen images of these caribou herds in Alaska, like millions, not millions, but hundreds of thousands of them just like crashing across rivers. That happened right here. And in fact, with archaeological evidence, we can show that they came right through here. All right. Based on a few different things. And remember the way that river was flowing. When you look closely at things, you can see how the current would have been when it was going backwards, where the fast water, slow water, all this kind of factors in, and you can kind of make out the pathway that these these animals would have taken. And right on an island, you find this. Now, this just looks like a big spear point. Cool, right? It's particular to technique constructed and made for hunting caribou by the caribou hunters of the Great Plains. Clearly, and another one of these was found farther downriver. There's 2 points in the St. Lawrence River these caribou were crossing into Canada. One of them is right here, basically coming right through somewhere in the area of vicinity of Round Island, where other paleo points have been found, connecting to Wellesley Island, going out to spend a day having lunch out on Eel Bay, where it was nothing but a big field, and then hop over to Grindstone, and then hopped across those little islands on the backside of Grindstone to get to Canada. And right along that route, we found this point. So we know that they were here. And we know that the caribou hunters of the Great Plains likely didn't carry boat technology with them. So what did they do? They beat up with the guys already living here high on the hog with fish and everything else and go, hey, you know those caribou are swimming around? If you give us a ride over, we'll show you how to hunt them. That's being like really simplistic. But I mean, something to that. There was interaction, all right? They came together. They interacted. Pretty neat. Okay, and so that period of time lasts until unclear, but somewhere around 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, this dry stand period starts ending. Climate gets wetter, and we start having a landscape by 9,000 years ago that starts looking like something we would recognize. Okay, the river level is probably a little bit different, a little bit higher still, but it would have been something we would have recognized. And this, again, this is the point where we call the terminal point of the paleo people. It's about 9,000 years ago. Begins the Archaic period, which is the longest period, which is just another term archaeologists use. Think of hunter-gatherers, right? That's the general thing. And when an archaeologist says Archaic, hunter-gatherer, paleo, mammoth hunter, big spears, when I say woodland, that means pottery and corn, growing things. That's kind of how archaeologists have broken up the three kind of time periods, just generally. But anyway, yeah, by 9,000 years ago, things are really humming along, looking much more like what we would recognize today, okay? And during the Archaic period, well, you'll see a few things here that represent quite a span of time of the Archaic period. And here, the stuff we start seeing shows us an intense amount of travel activity, an intense amount of trading, all right? Because now during this Archaic period, we're picking up materials from all over the place, all over the eastern United States, okay? And actually all over the northeast, eastern United States, and somewhat from areas out west, based on the fact that pieces of obsidian show up in this period. Now, if anybody knows geology, obsidian, you won't find it around here. We don't have any volcanoes, unless there's one that's going to open up soon. But yeah, you have to go pretty far out west to find volcanic material. And so there was major trade networks going on, okay? This piece in the middle, that's a copper point that came all the way from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's about 6,000 years old, between 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And these other cherts are basically, chert is another word for flint, if you're wondering what I mean. Chert technically is a little lesser grade than flint, but they're from a variety of sources. We end up with stuff up here from Pennsylvania, a couple different places in Pennsylvania, Ohio, places in Ontario, places in Vermont. We've come up with material that's just all over the place. And right now, I'm preparing much of the material I have to be looked at with an XRF gun, which X-ray fluorescence gun, which we now have access to a database created by my colleagues that can tell us where they came from, the original sourcing, which will be great, because that'll help us, because putting together that picture is a huge thing, right? But we do know, to a large extent, a lot of these trade networks, and this is kind of an important point, crisscross and kind of come to a junction of sorts right where we are, okay? Because at any given period of time, the difficulty of crossing the river or the Lake Ontario is pretty much evident, right? I mean, put yourself in a canoe and paddle across Lake Ontario, right? Who's going to do that? Put yourself in a canoe and paddle from Clayton over to Grindstone. It's tippy. But if you know what you're doing, if you're a river rat, you would go down maybe by Spicers or something, tack between those islands. You'd find your way around the wind. So there's strategic places people were crossing. We have learned that one of these strategic places is this pathway that kind of goes, it starts off, we can trace it all the way from Point Peninsula, Chameau Bay, all the way to Landings Bay area in Canada, Ontario, right? Kind of goes right through Grindstone, between that Grindstone and Eel Bay. And in a general sense, you can track it just surely on the archaeology. If I was to plot the heaviest concentrations of archaeology or Native American cultural sites, in this immediate region, you would see this big fat line from Chameau Bay over to Grindstone Island, this big arc right through Depauville, French Creek corridor, right up into Grindstone Island and on to Canada. It's basically one of the most heaviest concentrations of occupations in our region. And a lot of that's due to this pathways that start developing in the Archaic period. Because the Archaic period, these people are saying, thank goodness the climate isn't changing tomorrow, and the lake isn't disappearing, and the river, because these people must have had some kind of traditional generational knowledge, and there must have been some thought, we've been through the ringer, so this is great that things are kind of looking like this now and staying that way. I mean, really, because we do know that certain types of knowledges, big events, huge events, do maintain in the consciousness, and there is a sort of traditional or an oral DNA that's passed down through. It's like, 20 generations ago, the lake disappeared or something like that. So it would have been interesting to find out how much of a role that when people got to this point, they're like, wow, this is great. Things aren't changing anymore as much as they used to. So that's probably some degree the stability of the climate, stability of the waterways and things like that are a lot of the reasons probably why some of these trade networks develop more heavily and more solidly, so to speak. So in reality, that groundwork kind of lays the groundwork for the rest of the next 9,000 years or so. This trade network, this location, has a huge role in the people, the cultures that were to come. And the other thing is all of these people and all of these things, even though they're rocks and a piece of copper, well, this isn't, but the one thing they all have in common is that, like I say, they didn't really come from here. The material didn't, people did. They might have, I don't know. The copper point was found right on the foot trail along this pathway I was just speaking of. And most of these other points were found right along that trail. So those are good examples. That's why I put them up there. Those are actually came from this pathway I was talking about. And there are different varieties of time period materials. So it's pretty neat, but it kind of puts our area, again, at a great junction point. So we're getting a lot of things coming in and going out. So, like I said, the Archaic period lasts the longest. And the one thing that I can say about the Archaic period that is absolutely rock solid is that the way they lived, judged on where their sites are, it did not change from the earlier period where they're all doing the same thing in the same places. They're all living on shorelines. They're all harvesting freshwater marine resources or saltwater when they had the opportunity, right? But that theme never changes. And that, I think, sets these people a little bit apart from other of their contemporaries in the sense of, I should have mentioned that all the people I'm talking about are considered ancestral to the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois peoples. And this is what stands these people out differently from the rest of the Haudenosaunee, is that these people stayed focused on the water, always. In fact, in many circles, the Iroquois that were here and down the St. Lawrence River are referred to as the St. Lawrence Iroquois, because that's where they were living. So it just, that in itself is an indication that these people are a little different. They stuck by that shore. And nobody can tell you, and when I say Iroquois, that refers to the language group, right? So you have Algonquin, Iroquois. Nobody's been able to, and nobody ever will be able to tell you what proto-language that those people on the glacial shoreline were speaking. Was it Algonquin? Was it Iroquois? I don't know. All I know is that I've never seen evidence that says, well, the people living here packed up and left. Now, you can find gaps in the archaeological record, but that doesn't imply necessarily that there was nobody here. It just means that we haven't found the evidence. So some people can take it the other way. They can say, well, nobody was here. I don't buy that. Because in science, we're constantly learning how wrong we are. And that's true. Now, when the Archaic starts wrapping up, things again change, okay? And we get into what's called the early Archaic period, all right? Now you see there's big changes going on. Up until this point, we were using spear throwers, little hooks of wood that hooked onto a short spear and whipped that baby. Things like that, spear, up until sudden change. You can see this in the archaeological records. You think about this. You're going to put a rock this long and an arrow, shoot it in the bow. No, it's going to go 4 feet and fall. So you can see a giant shape or a change in the shape and size of the points that really start signifying, okay, these are arrowheads. All right. Hunting techniques, everything changes because you really can do a much different, much more effective, more efficient hunting. Even though, surprisingly, even in the very late woodland times when Europeans were arriving, they described something called a deer pound, which is a giant V-shaped fence, like miles long, made of brush, and natives would drive the deer to the middle of that, and they didn't stand there with a bow and arrows and shot, they stand there with spears and speared like 100 deer at a time or whatever for a big feast. But anyway, digress. But so at 3,000 years ago, yeah, that's the change point. You see pottery showing up. This is kind of a really early version. It's not quite the earliest, but that's one of the earliest versions we find up here. All right. And I've never had that dated, but I don't think you can right now, but because it's from a collection, but it's, it's a couple thousand years old. They're making pottery. Things started changing. They started hunting bow and arrows. They also started first start seeing agricultural indications, okay? Crazy thing is that nowadays with modern science, you can take a rock that they were grinding something on 3,000 years ago, and, it's one thing it was dipped in bleach, but most of the time it comes out of the dirt, out of the ground. And scientists now can actually extract off of the surface of that or the inside of the pots the silica skeletons of plant cells and determine what they were. So in that method, they're actually able to figure out what they were eating, that kind of thing. And that's where they've learned, that squash or squash-like plants are the earliest thing you would have seen, followed not by beans, but by corn. A lot earlier than people thought. So originally, what we all know as the Three Sisters wasn't the Three Sisters, it was two sisters waiting for the third for quite a while. And so this is kind of recent science has found that the beans made a late showing up here in a lot of places. So that's an interesting fact that we really didn't have an awareness of until recently. But some of these plants go back thousands of years that people are starting to grow. All right. And because we're on this like trade network where it's really easy for information technology to flow, likely that's why we were kind of on the cutting edge of some of this stuff. Okay. But so, yeah, this is the point that things really start changing. And we'd have native populations that we might be able to kind of recognize, guys with pottery and starting to live in villages versus earlier where we don't know for sure up here, but most places they were living in like clan units, smaller units. Once you get to this era, now you have these clan units or kind of coming together into larger groups. Coalescing is the word. And so that you start to have the first inklings of a village versus like a little clan enclave or something to that effect. And so the final Iroquois, or the final people of that woodland people, are the people we all really know most about, is the Iroquois speakers, right? The Iroquois people. And in our area, that's generally referred to as the Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. And depending on what map and whom you talk to, that it's kind of varies exactly what part of this area is, how it's divided up. That's up to them. But that's who has, it's not the right word, but jurisdiction, so to speak. So in other words, everything we find up here is considered ancestral to one of those three nations. That's just how it's perceived in the archaeology world, and to the folks that live in the nations. You ask them who's that power, they go, well, that's us. What's wrong with you? So because they are absolutely totally related, we just don't know how it parsed out. I mean, there's a lot of theoretical back and forth. A lot of brand new dating is coming out with the Iroquois by Dr. John Hart and Tim Abel. They've done a lot of dating. Jennifer Burtz, they've done a lot of dating on corn kernels. And so now there's some really definitive dates on some of the villages around here, because in most parts of Iroquois, you'll have a handful of villages in an area of 20 miles or whatever. Here we have in Jefferson County, there's like almost 70 villages. Now they weren't all occupied at once. We believe there was 5 to 6 groups, which is still a lot of groups, a lot of villages occupied at the same time in a pretty small area, comparatively speaking. Up here, we also break the mold in many ways because, for example, in Onondaga world or other, when they moved their village, it was moved several miles away, if not, I mean, well, more than several. It was moved a long ways away, right? Quite a ways away. Not so much for depletion of soil for agriculture, but depletion of firewood and animals. But up here, weirdly enough, don't do that. In fact, one of the groups up here, there's 4 of their villages they're not even a mile apart, aren't they? So they were not moving very far. Totally different than a lot of these other, but believe, this is my opinion, I guess I can be, well, I can give you some science, but so is marine resources. They still had access to those, at that point, unending marine resources, which the other Haudenosaunees didn't necessarily have in such abundance. Because again, you go to any region in the world, and where is the highest concentration of human valuable resources for food and sustenance? That's on coastal areas, whether it's a lake, a river, or an ocean. So no different here. So I believe that that's a main reason why the folks of Haudenosaunee up here, that's why they didn't need to move their village very far. All right. They had lots of marine resources. And the other thing I've told people is, listen, I spent a lot of time in a canoe up in a wilderness camp up in Canada. And you go to the same campsites, even though it's in the middle of nowhere, 100 miles from nowhere, that other people have gone to. And you look around the campsite, ain't no firewood here. Well, the first thing you do is send the boys out in one of the canoes to go get firewood. That same principle can be applied here. So, whereas if you're a totally landlocked person or a village, you've got to walk 30 miles to get firewood and haul it back. Here, you can just paddle to the nearest island or someplace, gather a bunch of firewood, throw it in your canoe. It's much more of a easier do, so to speak, I think, than a lot of places. And the thing, I guess, to also mention with the Haudenosaunee up here, the great mystery, okay? So the Haudenosaunee that we know today, in reality, have, unlike every other tribe in the United States, have never left their homeland, okay? You'll find the Seneca where the Seneca was. You'll find the Oneida where the Oneida were. You'll find the Onondaga, the same with Mohawk. Okay, they've been shoved around and messed with. I'm not saying that, but essentially, in reality, they're the only tribes that weren't just simply picked up and moved 1,000 miles away, which is remarkable. But weirdly enough, when the first European shows up, okay, Cartier in 1532, don't quote me, he shows up down 38, something like that. he shows up downriver, down below Montreal, and he comes up and he finds a river valley full of people, right? You big nations, oh wow. He's just amazed, right? All tons of people. Big deal. Mighty nations, okay? And return trip, I think, what was it, 15, 20 years later? Nobody here, and everybody wants to kill him. That's being simplistic about it. But something happened. Archaeologically, we know something was already happening when he had shown up, okay? But something happened so that these masses of people living where we are suddenly pull back. If you ask some archaeologists, they say, oh, it was abandoned. Myself and several others have uncovered plenty of evidence to say it was not fully abandoned. The population shrunk drastically, yes, but it was not fully abandoned. But something happened, some event, some cataclysmic event, because we do know archaeologically, based on a crazy thing called social network analysis, where you take a group of people's stuff and you break it into, attributes. Oh, they all like orange, they all like blue, they all like pink. And you do that on all these different groups and you see how they connect. Well, each one of them likes this. That's a rough way of putting together this idea that if you make a map of how these people connect, they each like green, they each like blue, they both hate black. That tells you they're interacting, right? So they do all this big complicated computer stuff and everything else, but they actually lay out that for a period of time, there was this balance in the Iroquois world between the Huron nations and the Five Nations. Now, I'm putting this in a simplistic terms, all right, because it's crazy science stuff. But there was this balance, right? Now, these people are generally kind of hostile to each other anyway, and for whatever reasons, are not maybe the greatest friends, I don't know, even though they're related. So the thing that was keeping them in balance, the science, this network analysis shows, was these groups here. These groups here were acting as, the scientific word is brokers. We were acting as brokers here to keep the peace. Everything was good, keep the peace. Something happened and the peace was broken, and there was people here withdrew back farther and just all heck broke out. Huron War broke out with the Iroquois. It was just a big mess. Cartier shows up and it just got worse. And it's also some thought to the fact that there was probably no European that came to America at that period of time who wasn't carrying disease. And what do? Here's a blanket, here's your trinket. And if you think about being on the river, and if you're down below Montreal, and this dude in this giant canoe with sails shows up and he's got these shiny things, and what are you going to do? You're going to grab one of those cool things and you're going to paddle up the river and show everybody. Meanwhile, you're spreading disease everywhere, because remember, St. Lawrence, just like the Route 81 of back then. So that level that had some kind of effect on why these folks disappeared. But I think probably been babbling long enough. But yeah, it's quite a story. It's hard to put it all in an hour, 13,000 years. But the biggest thing is trying to give you all an overview of how big a change is that our landscape has gone through. At the same time, the people stayed with it. They stayed here, and they stayed with their boats, and they stayed with their river, because the river kind of never went anywhere once it was born. Just kind of changed really a lot. But I don't think that ever changed even right through the later woodland times, and you actually don't see people living on the edge of the water only for a few hundred years at the very end of the woodland period, the Iroquois period. They just moved a little bit inland from the lake and the river. But other than that, every single culture, people that's been here for the last 13,000 years has been directly related to the freshwater marine environment. And that, I think, is the underlying theme that I wanted to get to all of you folks. And that's why I think it was a good place to do this talk for kind of a final time, because I got a lot of other stuff to talk about, but for future talks. But yeah. So thank you all for listening.
You have one online. Mike Flood has asked if you could talk about the grooved cut in the granite at Frink Park.
Yes, they were cut by the glacier. So that basically was, while the glaciers are moving across the landscape and shaping our landscape is what caused those smooth, beautiful, polished rocks we have, and also caused the dead flat limestone that we have. That thing just came through and sheared stuff off. But, okay, I'll go to the guy in the back there because he went first. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ken. I think I asked you the same question a couple of years ago when you were talking the Weatherhorn farm,
Mm-hmm.
where they found that Iroquois longhouse. I
Mhm.
happened to be out there at the same time. Have they dated that village on how old that village was?
That one they don't have a fine-tuned corn date for yet. They're trying for that, but all of the sites in that area, in our area here, would have been, say, a rough estimate would have been 1450 to 1550.
It would be like 500, 600 years old.
Well, yeah. And that's just a rough time.
And part B, that question, is there any place where, like, I'm teaching school again, is like, the kids ask me, well, is there any place you can do archaeological digs with classes? There's
Not,
you have to be on private lands and they have to give you permission.
yeah, no, that's a tough one right there. That's a tough one because
Are they doing, I mean, are there universities that are doing digs around the area? No.
this is the least researched place on the planet, if you ask me at times. But,
So rich with opportunity then.
yeah,
Okay.
The villages,
Uh-huh.
the Iroquois and the other groups, villages, what was the sort of size and configuration of those villages?
well, the Iroquois villages, in our area could range, let me translate metric in my brain, from about 2 acres to 4 acres, roughly. And they contain 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 longhouses, depending on the size. And a longhouse could be as little as 14 by 60 or 70, I think, is some of the numbers I've seen, and quite a bit bigger. But the really big longhouses were the ones associated with the 3 other nations, the Haudenosaunee. The longhouses up here that weren't generally as big, or the villages as big, as the later villages downstate. I think the longest estimate I've seen would have been like 100 and some feet for the length of one, maybe for our area.
So the villages tended to consist of a long house with everybody living in the house.
In our area, it was usually probably 2 longhouses, but there were, you would have several families living in each longhouse. Yep, that's how they were divided up. About every 12 feet was a hearth. And then the families would share that. Okay. Do you have a question?
When the waters receded
Mhm.
very quickly, that period, I can't remember what it was called, but it must have left a really nice sediment or rich area for growing crops. Were there wetlands?
Oh, it was all big marsh, pretty much. It was, when it initially drained down, it would have drained down into something that looked more like Alaska. All right, so it would have been much more frozen and tundra-like. And it would have been quickly taken over by prairie grasses, things like that, that kind of grass stuff.
And when did like cattails come into the
Yeah, well, cattails, I don't know. They are native to our area. Certain species of them, but they're no longer in balance in our area. That's kind of your question, but yeah, no. So all these things, when exactly that ecology developed, I'm not entirely sure, but it would have been post that period because until you get after this dry stand period of like 10,000 years ago or so, then I don't think we would have started really seeing a full development, let's say, of our river wildlife.
Yeah.
I don't know, flora and fauna, or wouldn't have seen the most flora that we have now. I don't know, to be honest.
So Angela Mara has asked, you mentioned the Chameau barrens and plants that grow there. Roughly how old are the fossils that are able to be seen there?
That, I am not a geologist, so I have no clue. They're Ordovician limestone. You'd have to look that one up. Because I'm not sure that falls into geology, not so much archaeology. It's in the millions, I'm sure. But
If there was to be a dig for a construction purpose in Clayton, the actual peninsula, and you were to go down, say, 12 feet,
Mhm.
would you be likely to find archaeology in that situation?
well, I'll put it this way: rarely do you just go anywhere and just start digging a hole and find stuff. I mean, archaeology is a landscape-based science in many ways. All right. You have to look at the landscape and assess it to understand where people would have been. And then you have to factor in, okay, what time period are you talking about? And you have to look at it from that perspective. So it's not like there's a continuous blanket of archaeology to be found at a certain level. You could go a lot of places and dig a lot of holes and not find anything. I've spent a lot of time marching through plowed fields and not found anything. So it's not like it's everywhere you go. It's in an archaeological sense, it's extremely dense with archaeological occupations. But that doesn't mean there's one every 5 feet. I mean, there could be a mile between sites, and there is literally nothing there. But to an archaeologist, when I look at the landscape and I say, okay, that is a very likely habitation site for this reason, that reason, that reason. And also, I have the ability to have in my head modeling of what lifestyles and types of lifestyles people were living, right? So in other words, in archaeology, you develop a model in your head of the landscape and the living that people were doing at a given time. And that really helps you look at sites or look at places and go, okay, that is probably more sensitive an area than over here. But beyond that, it really gets a lot more muddy than people think in terms of being able to just go out and buy stuff. I mean, I can go find things, but it's not. It's based on a 40 years or 50 years or whatever it's been.
Another
Yes, sir.
one.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Bob Lovell asked if you could comment on where the sturgeons fit into your timeline.
The sturgeon would have basically fit into the timeline at probably, and again, I'm not sure exactly when the sturgeon would have made its first appearance in the St. Lawrence Valley. That's a good question, because I really don't know. Because 13,000 years ago, there wasn't a St. Lawrence Valley. And, prior to that, there was a period of time when there wasn't any water. It was all ice. So I'm not, right? So it's very hazy point in time. And I'm not sure at what point in the ecological evolution that the sturgeon make its way in there. But I'm assuming that as soon as there was fresh water flowing into New York Harbor, that whatever processes were starting to take place, and the fish eventually made their way up into the fresh waters and into the network. I'm not sure. That's a good question for an evolutionary biologist or something like that. Somebody with a higher grade pay than me.
It made me think of the beluga whale information that you shared. I thought it was very fascinating how Lake Champlain was once salt water.
Yes.
And like you explained how the salmon got landlocked.
Yes.
Was there ever a time period when it was a possibility for the beluga whales to be?
No, they're salt water. And
But
a salmon is I don't know the right term, but they're dual, right? They can go from salt to fresh, okay? Normally they die after they go to the fresh, right?
Yeah.
But some of them survived.
Mhm.
And that's how you start an evolutionary training,
Sure.
right? The survival's bred, and then so no, the beluga, they're strictly a saltwater geared towards that, saltwater marine life. And the Champlain Sea, they didn't necessarily just pull the cork on it. Basically, what it was something called isostatic rebound, where the land starts rising up because the glacier's gone. The glacier's way a lot. So land starts rising back up and the sea starts going back. And so the whales just would have retreated with the ocean.
That answered my question perfect.
If you ever go up 89 to Burlington, Vermont, right up just the first exit into Burlington, there's 2 whale tails statues there. That's why.
Because the crown bones there.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. Should have mentioned, I forgot that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Yeah.
I was interested in your comment about the lack of volcanic activity in the area.
Uh-huh.
I was under the impression that there was volcanic activity around Bald Rock.
Nope.
In a
Nope.
sort of Macabre Hill.
Nope,
Bald
that's
Rock.
Potsdam sandstone formation. Nope, there's 3 stone formations. It's the limestone, there's the Potsdam sandstone, and there's the granite. The granite's Canadian shield. The limestone's an Ordovician era limestone, and the Potsdam sandstone. Okay, just an interesting point is that all 3 of them come together basically right here in French Creek. But yeah, no volcanoes, go a long ways away.
Are we on a tectonic plate? Is the same order?
There is a weak tectonic plate. Yeah, no, that's partially the reason for the river. Part of it's glacial, part of it is tectonic activity, absolutely.
If you go by the dump in Alex Bay, that you sometimes let to see,
Yeah, that's Potsdam sandstone. You can see that.
right, and the bottom's granite.
Yeah,
So
yes,
there's
you can
2
see it
there.
overlaid.
That's why you always see a lot of geologists studying there.
Yeah, that whole route up there, but yeah.
I'll just share this. I thought it was kind of interesting what you were saying about the natives. While we were visiting up in Alaska, we visited with a woman from the Yupik
Mhm.
tribe, and which there are only about 250 left, but she shared beluga whale jerky with us. So, and this was just a few years ago. So I didn't like it, but very politely,
Oh, yeah.
but they're still, doing that.
Oh, yeah. Well, you never know. Maybe their ancestors
Yeah,
were here at one
and
point.
their treat, is like their ice cream is
Yeah,
when the
I know what
herring
it is. Nasty stuff.
lay their roe, and they just go along the shores and pick them like berries and fill baskets with herring roe. And that is their wonderful treat, the herring eggs, like caviar.
Yeah. Well, if I was living in survival mode, I'm sure I'd like.
We would have to grow to like it, wouldn't we?
Yes.
But it was fascinating. I didn't like it, but it's fascinating to say I tried it.
Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, folks, I have one young lady.
Well, I just waited to, I don't think we touched on this, and if you could just briefly tell me, how did the river start flowing another way?
Because the lake dropped down. We get all our water from Lake Ontario. If you take Ontario down low
So
enough,
everything else is up higher.
well, Lake Ontario is higher. We flow towards the ocean on the river. Now, if you take Lake Ontario right out of the picture, and the river can't really flow,
So
when the lake's lower than the river's gonna flow
Oh, okay,
into the
so the
river.
lake became lower.
Oh, by hundreds and
Okay.
hundreds of feet.
Okay,
Yeah, no. It's 300 or 400 feet, something like that.
and you talked one time how the islands were formed? Was it the weight of the glacier, and I can't remember,
The islands?
Thousand Islands?
Oh, well, it's a combination of glacial activity and the tectonic plate, action that's the St. Lawrence Valley.
Okay,
So, everything you see basically above the water is formed by glaciers. Glaciers brown, that nice smooth shapes and everything. That's That's done by the glaciers. You go down into the bottom of the river and, that's where the tectonic part of the equation comes in, but it's a combination of things. But most of what we see is glacial activity.
Thank you.
Thank you all so
Thank
much
you.
for,
Thank you.
listening.